Many longtime listeners know that our podcast platform was initially focused on interviews about the many spiritual paths that Myanmar offers meditators and monastics. But when the coup hit, we couldn't in good conscience continue to tell those stories, with many monastic sites on fire or occupied by soldiers, and the Burmese people living under the military's reign of terror. So we expanded our mission to cover a wider range of post-coup Myanmar stories. Still, some guests have a unique insight into both the intersection of the spiritual with the worldly, allowing a deeper understanding of both planes. Today's guest squarely fits in that category, as you will soon hear. Let's get to that interview now.
Together we can achieve so much, yet it is not enough. We don't need solidarity in theory. We need more of it in practice.
I'm pleased to be joined by Ayya Yeshe. She is a Bhikkhuni, currently in Tasmania in Australia, joining us to talk about her own spiritual journey, as well as some of the monastic response and engaged Buddhism concerning the military coup in Myanmar and how different monastic and practitioner communities are responding to the ongoing crisis and coup that's happening there. So, Ayya, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So if we can start by having you share a bit about your own personal connections to Myanmar, if you've been there, where you've been, or perhaps even away from Myanmar, how the different traditions or centers or lineages have impacted you, just to get a sense of how your own spiritual journey has intersected with Myanmar Buddhism and Myanmar monasticism.
I don't have a super close connection to Myanmar, but I'm a Buddhist nun, and Myanmar is a Buddhist country, and we're part of the, world Buddhist community. I view myself as a non-sectarian Buddhist nun, and one of my teachers is Theravada. He's from the Thai forest tradition, but I kind of view all these threads as part of a greater weaving.
Right. Thanks for that. Learning a bit about your own spiritual journey in nunhood, can you tell us a bit about what shape your early spiritual interest took and what eventually led you to nunhood and the different traditions that you explored along the way?
My father died when I was 14, and that sent me into a tailspin about like a crisis of meaning and what's the meaning of life. And then I went to India when I was 17 and discovered Buddhism, and mostly Tibetan Buddhism. And I discovered a profound peace and kind of realized that I could choose my thoughts, which was very liberating. That I didn't have to just follow whatever thoughts came into my head, and I could observe emotions without being drowned by them. That was a big change, because up until that point, as a teenager, I'd been rather depressed due to my father's death. And at 23, I ordained as a nun, but I quickly found out that there wasn't any support for Western monastics and that women were not equal. And that was very disheartening discovery. So I ended up staying in Theravadan temples because they support monastics and appreciate them. And that's where I met my mentor, Bhante Sujato, and his monastery, Santee Forest Monastery in Australia, and the Ajahn Chah tradition. So I've kind of enjoyed the privilege of studying both of these traditions, which both have their good points. And there's, that saying from the Buddha, all dharmas have the one taste, the taste of liberation. Although I understand you can't just mishmash traditions together, you have to honor the context of those traditions. I feel that Theravada Buddhism offers a really profound way and an intact tradition of how to be a monastic, whereas Tibetan Buddhism, it's a little more in the distant past, and especially Tibetans don't really invest in training Western monastics, and therefore they're often refugee, kind of homeless in a way and without any roots because they're neither accepted by the host culture nor the new culture they live in, or their own culture. And about 80 or 90% of them disrobe. And I took Bhikkhuni ordination with the Thich Nhat Hanh community in Plum Village in 2006 because I feel that the full ordination of nuns is a really important step for empowering women to practice and make them not feel like second-class citizens or lepers, for the for the crime of being a woman, basically. And that Plum Village Sangha and the mindfulness community has been a really big support. And, engaged Buddhism is the way I've practiced going forward, as well as being a contemplative. I ended up starting a charity in an Indian slum and living there for about 11 years with the ex-untouchable so-called Dalit community that converted to Buddhism in 56 to escape the oppressive Hindu caste system. And those people have been so kind to me. And in return, I was able, not that I intended in the beginning, but they were just so poor that I realized, you can't think about spiritual things when your stomach is empty. So we ended up starting a girls' home and study centres and women's job training centres for those people. And that is Bodhicitta Foundation India. And I also have a monastery in Australia called Bodhicitta Dakini Monastery, which is only a year and a half old, but has taken 20 years to get the funding for.
That's wonderful. Thanks for giving us that bit of background. You reference engaged Buddhism as being something that is important to you. This is an important term to define and understand exactly your relationship with it. And especially for Buddhism and especially for a monasticism, where there's this pull between engagement with the world, and certainly the Buddha, the historical Buddha back in his day, did not want his monastics to retreat entirely the way the rules are set up. There's some sort of interaction that's guaranteed and required. And yet there also is a large degree of renunciation, of a need to renounce. And that's true whether one is a meditator and walking on the path to some extent in the lay life, and certainly true for monastics, for monks and nuns. And so there's this somewhat of a tension, of a dynamic between where exactly does one engage and where exactly does one renounce. I had Alan Senake on an earlier episode. He's largely credited with being one of the early Buddhist thinkers of defining and bringing about engaged Buddhism initially in I believe it was the 80s with nuclear nonproliferation. And we talked extensively about his definition, interaction with what he defined as engaged Buddhism, as that's such an important part of your life and your experience and even your identity as a monastic in how you take on the practice. Can we hear your definition as to what you understand engaged Buddhism to be and how it manifests in your life?
That's a really valuable but complex question. I didn't start out as an engaged Buddhist. I started out as a fairly orthodox Tibetan Buddhist, but I was committed to the idea of bodhicitta, the idea of working for the liberation of all beings. What I saw in the world made me an engaged Buddhist. And I think Westerners have this misunderstanding of what Buddhist community is, and they underestimate the value of community. A monastery in Asia is more than just a place where you go and sit alone and find liberation separate from the world. A monastery is a community. It is a place that if you lose your job, you'll probably go and volunteer to get some food. It's a place where elderly people come for a sense of meaning and support in their practice and community connection, something to do. It's a place where orphans would go to get an education. And it's a place where people go for blessings, refuge, solace, to find a good husband or wife, because if you want to find a good person, they're going to be hanging out at the monastery, right? So monasteries are communal hubs in Asia. They are not just places for individuals who are disconnected from society. And a lot of the problems we're having now in the West are because we are disconnected from community, we're disconnected from the planet, and we don't have a sense of our place in the world. We're just completely obsessed with individual identity. And, if you're a person who doesn't fit into the mainstream, and your identity is under threat, like a trans person, that's a very different thing to someone who is just part of this kind of this cult of the individual, this kind of narcissistic overemphasis. Like, for example, social media, always taking selfies, and it kind of actually is quite negative for mental health. We've taken it to individual freedom and identity, and the search for your own truth can be a wonderful thing. But I feel like we've taken it to the nth degree, and it's a bit unbalanced now, because to rest in peace, to have a spiritual practice, is to understand your sacred interbeing with all of life, is to understand that you have non-self elements. Your non-self elements are your parents, your culture, your teachers who gave you an education. Everything you have comes from others, like food, shelter, clothes. Your survival is dependent upon others. And therefore, spiritual practice and happiness are not just a personal matter, they're a communal one. If we live in a society where there is so much misery and uncertainty and no safety, it will impact our capacity to reach our full potential. And if you look at it, for example, a plant, and you see the plant is not thriving, it's not growing well, you don't blame the seed. You look at the soil, the potting mix, the compost, the pot, the garden bed, and you fix it. And each one of us is a result of social, gender, spiritual, economic conditions. And if we, rehabilitate those conditions, the individual can also be rehabilitated, so to speak. So happiness isn't just a personal matter, and that is why just focusing on your own practice while the world falls apart is not very viable. Although, our own spiritual practice is very important, and seclusion is necessary. It's the building block, the foundation stone of Buddhist practice. Communal practice is often underestimated and misunderstood, because Westerners have just taken this insight practice and left everything else, like ethics, altruism, community, which were naturally there as part of Buddhist practice. I mean, the Buddha spent many months every year on the road teaching different people, encountering different people, and different people would come to the monastery every day. So it's a myth to say that monks and nuns live in solitude all the time. And, you know, they actually meet with lay people every day when they have a meal. They're completely dependent upon lay people. And if they lose that connection, Buddhism will disappear in that country. So, you know, I started a charity because at first I was just chanting and giving people blessings in India, but somebody put a dying baby in my lap and it had diarrhea. It was like a little skeleton, you know, and they were like, please pray for this baby. And I was thinking, you know, this is not upaya. This is not skillful means. This baby doesn't need just prayers. This baby needs a $2 tablet that will save its life. And I, as a person with white privilege from a wealthy country, have the ability to do this. So I just realized it was patronizing to teach people about spiritual things when they were basically starving and didn't have basic human rights or education. So, you know, I realized, okay, this garden bed of human beings needs more nourishment. Let's lift their survival and their education and their human rights situation, and then they can think about spiritual teachings and practice. And that's how the Bodhicitta Foundation India started. And I didn't start out as a feminist, you know, either. But one day, you know, I was constantly treated like a second-class citizen. I was more or less told to feel ashamed because I was a woman and that it was my bad karma to be a woman. And I felt oppressed and depressed. And it took me a while to see the invisible glass ceiling. Like when you see males are continuously treated with respect and given access to resources, like the Tibetan lamas would sit there eating food people had offered, and the Western monastics who were running the Dharma Center didn't receive anything and had to pay rent and work in a lay job to stay in the center, even though they were the ones really doing most of the work to run the center. It made me question why I was expected as a woman to do all this unpaid labor and my contribution wasn't respected. And one day a Tibetan Lama just said to me straight up, pray to be reborn as a man, because being a woman is an obstacle to liberation. And all of the, you know, sexual misconduct, sexual harassment of women in the Dharma, you know, has just really made me, it's turned me into a feminist, you know, and it's made me see that we are not yet equal, and that is not the point of Dharma. The point of Dharma is not just social justice, but without social justice, someone reaching their human and awakened potential is difficult, as we can see in Myanmar, you know, without human rights, when there's bullets flying past you, when you're under threat of death just for speaking the truth, as we saw with the nun Sachavati, who was put in a prison camp and terrorized just for the crime of being a bhikkhuni. Without human rights, without basic equality, spiritual practice is, you know, becomes very difficult. And for too long, women have been the main supporters of the Dharma, running centers, donating food, keeping the monasteries going, coming to teachings. And they haven't had a dignified place in the fourfold Sangha, which is just not, it's not okay. I mean, in the axial age, the Buddha accepted women had the capacity for awakening. So why, and treated them as human beings in an age where they were considered chattel. Why, 2,600 years later, are we still struggling to have our spiritual capacity and our opportunity for practice be acknowledged? So it was by necessity that I became a socially engaged Buddhist, because I literally had nowhere to live as a nun, and I was constantly a second-class citizen as a woman. And I saw all around me, you know, half the world living on $3.25 a day, 40,000 kids dying from hunger every day. And I just thought, if the Buddha was here, like in Bodh Gaya, where the Buddha got enlightened, there is an apartheid, if you like, an economic apartheid. There is the marble enclosed, air-conditioned monasteries for international Buddhists. And there is the real world that the descendants of the Buddha live in, which for the majority is a world of vicious poverty, heat, degradation, desperation, and hunger. And there's a barbed wire fence and soldiers with guns in between. And I thought, if the Buddha was here, which side of the fence would he be on? So it's just, you start practicing, your heart opens, and you look all around you and you see there's being suffering. So how can you do nothing? My question is, how can you not be a socially engaged Buddhist, to be honest, with the way the world is, But yeah, I guess we have to balance that with our own contemplative practice.
Right. That's actually the question I want to throw back at you, because you're describing basically two evolutions and transformations in your life: that of becoming a Buddhist, a monastic, and then that of becoming an engaged Buddhist, which means that it infers that there was a period that you were delving into the spiritual practice before you had a greater social awareness. And you've talked a bit about the transformation that led to that wider mission of engaged Buddhism. You've defined the reasons for it and some of the conditions that led to that opening. But what I'm curious about is how when the Buddhism was, when you were following some form of Buddhism and practice, but you were not yet following an engaged form of Buddhism, how would you characterize that period? What was your involvement or understanding, perhaps even misunderstanding, of how you were coming to the practice and devoting yourself to that spiritual journey without yet realizing the engaged part of it that would so define your monastic career afterwards and today? So what were those conditions present as you think back that led you to a form of Buddhism where that was missing? And perhaps, like, why did that make sense for you at the time? If you're characterizing how you were understanding the world and how you were understanding practice, what were you conceptualizing to follow a practice that didn't have that component? And I think the reason I'm asking is I think that it's very interesting, because many practitioners listening might fall into a similar category. They might, with starting out or with conceptualizing the practice, that the conditions that you were in and the way that you were seeing things might be similar to how some listeners are today. And so I think it'd be interesting to go back and revisit just how you were seeing things at the time, and then understanding the shift that allowed to see a wider vision and wider possibility and field and even responsibility of practice.
I think, to be honest, I was already a bit of an advocate for the underdog, because I had been a street kid, and I left home because me and my mother weren't getting on. So I'd already lived on the street and seen poverty, and seen kind of the underside of life. But I did, I guess in the beginning, my approach to the Dharma was, I'm suffering and I have no peace. And what is the meaning of it all? And if I don't find these things, if I don't have some peace, if I can't manage my mind and my overwhelming feelings, I'm not really in a position to help the world. I think that was my thinking at that time. So my priority was to find meaning and to find peace. And through, practice and meditation, I was able to take out the mental trash and find some joy, find some peace, and find some space. And therefore, I then had the mental capacity and the heart capacity to think about the world. Whereas prior to that, I was just overwhelmed by my own suffering. So I guess it is actually due to the gift of the Buddha.
So you were speaking before about the conditions that women face, I think, I guess it's fair to say, in wider society, as well as in monastic environments and Buddhist environments. And you referenced one particular nun who faced much more rigorous treatment and persecution. I wonder if you can go more into the story that you just referenced very briefly with her.
Mm. I don't, know too much more. What I know is that I believe 2 or 3 nuns took ordination in Myanmar. One of them was ethnically like from the Chinese Burmese border. One of them was a Burmese nun who lives in California at Mahapajapati. Actually, I don't have the full details, but I also know that a nun called Sachavadi, who was a very respected a precept nun and had studied very well within the Burmese system, took ordination. And then I believe when they returned to Myanmar, at least Sachavadi was detained in a prison camp that is full of kind of political prisoners. And she was, questioned for many days and physically forced to take off the robes and shamed, basically. And she kind of had a mental breakdown as a result of this. And then when she eventually got out, she, due to that emotional trauma and PTSD, she disrobed and kind of is living now a private life, married or with a partner in America. But the whole experience was so traumatic for her, she withdrew from public life. And it's really sad considering that, Bhikkhu Bodhi, Bhikkhu Analayo, and Bhante Sujato, Ajahn Brahms, Ayya Loka, and so many senior monastics and academics have done so much research that shows the validity of Bhikkhuni ordination or Bhikshuni ordination, if you're in Mahayana, is possible, that revival is possible, or that the lineage in China is a valid one. That there are still people who are not accepting this lineage. I also know of nuns who have been assaulted by very senior monks in Burma, who had they had to flee the country because the possibility of exposing such misbehavior meant they were actually a target for murder. So, yeah, there's some major problems with human rights, both within the Sangha and with the government in Myanmar, which I guess many people are familiar with. It's very sad when you have this situation where women are not equal human beings, and that also impacts. We know many monastics, both male and female, have gone missing if they protested about the military junta. So, yeah, it's a pretty dire situation. But if anyone talks about it, they'll be refused a visa, and so many people know this, and they feel heartbroken about it, but they can't talk about it because they won't be allowed back in the country.
Yeah, that's right. And I think it also shines a light on how interesting this current time is of revolution in Myanmar, because revolution is a time. It might start small, but then when it gets wider, it makes you re-examine every bit of the consciousness of the society that is set up and ordered, and things that are unquestioned start to be questioned. And the revolution in Myanmar started with simple pleas of release Aung San Suu Kyi, and she's our rightful leader. And many of the young Bamar who were protesting did not really see a cause outside of our Bamar Buddhist leader was falsely imprisoned and needs to be released. That was really the start and finish of what they were saying. But as the revolution dragged on, as the resistance movement grew, this young generation started to see beyond this and started to realize, well, wait a second, what about the ethnics? What about the non-Bamar? What about the non-Buddhists? What about, my gosh, what about the Rohingya? Constantly terribly persecuted group. What about women? What about LGBT? And started to open up beyond, well, what is this? And I've had so many conversations, some of them on air that have been published, with people in real time who have opened from feeling that, well, just as my freedoms are being restricted and just as I love freedom and safety, how can I advocate on behalf of myself and my people when there's others in my country that don't have this, or that even I'm uncomfortable with, or that even I'm stigmatizing? And so everything just kind of came out, and everything is still coming out. And I think this also goes towards the conversation we're having now of women in Burmese society, of women in monastic society, and of the lay monastic relationship. All of these things are being refigured and reevaluated. Not to say that Myanmar is going to suddenly go from being a traditional conservative Buddhist society to something altogether new. That's not usually how things work, but that something is shifting, especially with the younger generation. And people are starting to look at what kinds of monks they want, what kind of sangha they most suits them, and looking at the role of women in society and nuns in the order. And these things are starting to be questioned by a larger segment of the population for one of the first times in such a wider way. So in that sense, it is exciting. I hesitate to use that word because the situation is just so devastating and so terrible, and in no way wanting to represent even silver linings from that. Just acknowledging the terror that so many are under, and yet at the same time, history and events have a funny way of bringing other things out. And I think even many Burmese have talked about, have expressed a kind of gratitude or interest in the fact that these things are now coming out, and they're able to come out in ways that were never before. So many of these things are being refigured and discussed and understood in different ways, and examining what kind of society they want to build and what suits them as everything is kind of coming apart and under the hood and under examination, under the microscope, one can say. So, so with that, and with seeing the changes that Myanmar society is going through in this really difficult period, I wonder, as a committed monastic that has been involved in engaged Buddhist issues around the world and seeing this develop in Myanmar, how have you been following it and understanding it from afar? What have you been learning? How have you been engaged? How has it perhaps provoked you or pushed you or affected you in terms of your own response and your own practice and your own engagement, and also your community? What has been your relationship with these unfolding events and this crisis in Myanmar?
Well, Ayya Vimala, who is a non-binary monastic friend of mine, has a close relationship with Myanmar, and so do several other monastic friends of mine. And, they were expressing their heartbrokenness about what was happening and about the monastics that had gone missing for simply asking, for democracy. And as someone who is kind of familiar with activism, I just said to Ayya Vimala, you have this, you want to do something about it, so why don't you, start a social media campaign? And that's where we started the alms ball movement, which is an ancient Buddhist practice of, like, if you're protesting unjust leadership or bad actions on the part of lay people, you deny them the merit of offering you food, dana, and you turn your bowl upside down. So on May 9th, we started an action to support the people and Sangha of Myanmar in their nonviolent protests by requesting monastics from around the world to send in pictures of themselves with overturned alms bowls or with a three-finger pro-democracy sign. So a lot of people, took this photo of themselves, and it was posted in Buddhist Door and the Democratic Voice of Burma news. And many people got involved, just to say that we are very worried about the monks who have gone missing, especially the monks that were featured in that photo with the three finger sign and the kind of band-aids on their mouth, or saying they're tired of being silenced with the upside down bowl. And that campaign has spread through social media and kind of inspired conversations about what is going on in Burma. But many people have also been sending aid to Burma through unofficial channels, humanitarian aid. But apart from that, Burma is a bit of a black box, and it's hard to only through informal means, we get tales of human rights atrocities and people driven in trucks out into the forest and just murdered, and kinds of horrible atrocities going on, and it can make you feel a little bit helpless. But this kind of thing is happening all over the world. Actually, it's happening in Tibet. It's happening to the Rohingya. It's unfortunately disturbingly common. That is why we need to even. It's even happening in America. So we need to be vigilant citizens to keep democracy alive and to elect leaders that are worthy of our vote, and to engage in protests and solidarity with the poor. As someone who probably has more of a connection to Myanmar than me, is there anything that I've left out that you think we could be doing to raise awareness and help people in Myanmar? Because I'm by no means an expert on this issue.
Right. I don't think there's a comprehensive list. I think that every week I'm seeing different initiatives that other people are doing that never occurred to me. And I think that's some of the brilliance of and the dynamic qualities and creativity of what could be done, that it's not just a limited number of things or a checklist, and that many people have been incredibly creative and dynamic in terms of what they've done, from the creative arts to music to food or different media, different fundraising campaigns, different kind of art events. There's just so many things that one could be doing. When I get asked that question, the way I usually answer it is that it just starts with volition. It just starts with deciding that one wants to come off the sideline and take part in the current troubles that are going on and be on the side of good and be an advocate on the side of human rights and democracy and the equitable future that many are trying to build there. And once one makes that decision, which probably is the hardest part, I mean, whether those barriers are different views of Buddhism or meditation, which some people mistakenly, I would say, feel that a disengagement from different worldly things, or the world is just inherently messy and everything is left to its own karma, so we should just withdraw from that and pursue our own means and our own liberation. Whether it's that, or whether it's just one's own life or other kinds of selfish interests or entertainment, I think that the first step is just deciding one is going to be involved to some extent. And there could be very, very small ways that one are involved, and they still make an impact, because there's not many people, especially a year and a half on, there's not many people many allies that are still standing steadfast and making this a priority. This doesn't mean that one just simply does this instead of all their acts and prioritizes it on that level, but that there's some level of involvement and engagement that can happen no matter how small it is. And if a lot of people are doing very small actions, those do amount to something. And so that volition to simply decide to take part in some way, to give money, to inform other people about what's going on, whether it's media or local politicians or local community, whether it's to fundraise collectively, whether it's to do some kind of creative event or art or article or something that just shines awareness. There are just so many ways. And I think it just first starts with just deciding that one is going to do something. And then once that volition is there and present and solid, then it just becomes a matter of, well, how much can I give and how much time do I have and what kind of activity can I do or what kind of resources do I have on hand? And then it's just kind of fitting with what one's life abilities are. And some people are very busy. And, we look for volunteers all the time to help our nonprofit. And when volunteers come, sometimes they might just say, 4 hours a month, that's what I have available. And great. Okay. 4 hours a month. This is a task we need. And that's 4 hours a month that is now accounted for that we didn't have anyone to do and that we didn't really have the resources to do ourselves. And so, really never underestimate the amount that one can give. And there's no such thing as doing something that's just too small that it's negligible. Everything really does matter. And I've seen that with my own eyes. And so I think cultivating that volition and cultivating that clear determination that one wants to and is willing to act on behalf of others, knowing how bad things are there for so many who've lost so much and have very little means left to be able to advocate for themselves, that those of us who do have a degree of privilege can step up and do something. And I think everything starts with that volition, and no one can turn that volition on for you and no one can determine the extent of that volition. But when that volition is established, then the doors really just open up to, okay, who am I? What can I do? What can I learn? What are my interests? What am I comfortable with? What time do I have available? What resources do I have? And then it becomes an easier path to let go of the guilt, let go of the confusion, let go of the different voices, and really just see like, okay, well, this is what I'm able to do, and this is what I'm going to. And then, right now, Myanmar needs all the allies it can get of all stripes. It's been a forgotten place for some time. They're calling it the Forgotten Civil War now. In World War II, it was called the Forgotten Front. That was the name of the fighting that took place in Burma. So it has a history of being forgotten, and it has a history of being presented without nuance as black and white. And I think those that take the time to understand and appreciate the nuance and take the time to not make it forgotten in 2022, there's a whole generation that is ready to risk everything and sacrifice everything for their rights and for their freedom. And do we let them stand alone, or do we support that in some way from our position in freedom? So to me, it all starts with that volition.
Are there any sources, where people can read about what life is like inside Myanmar under the junta and the kind of sufferings that are going on? Somehow we've reversed roles now, but I think that's okay. Are there sources that people can read and empathize and ignite their compassion from?
Well, I guess it depends on what kinds of information one wants to find. Obviously, our platform is one kind of resource. I think we specialize in long-form discussions that brings people from many different nuanced backgrounds to be able to share from their perspective, whether it's human rights, whether it's Buddhism, whether it's the arts, journalism, history, scholarship, whatever the background is of the guest. We get to enter their world and their perspective for the time that they are able to join us on the show. So for those that like long form discussions, that's definitely a place. For those that are trying to follow up on the daily news, there's a number of different sites. There's all the local journalism, Myanmar Now and Frontier and DVB and the Irrawaddy, Kip Thit. There's a number of different local media outlets one can have. The international media isn't really covering it that great these days. Sometimes you do get a big feature or some kind of documentary. Channel 4 has been working on a documentary in England for some time of the resistance movement. I think for those listeners that are tuning into this particular podcast episode with an interest in the intersection of Buddhism and practice and social engagement, I would recommend a number of essays and particularly episodes we've had on that topic. We've had a number of guests that have really delved deep into this intersection of what it's like to be a meditator or monastic on a spiritual path, and what you do when you see an entire country on fire, and how you navigate that intersection, which is very, very difficult. And there are no clear or obvious answers for what to do. It's, as the situation has devolved, the ambiguity of what our role is and how we can respond has also been more challenging to figure out. So that's kind of an open, ongoing conversation that I think we're probably, this platform is probably, I would say, pretty unique in hosting that, and being able to, from what I see of how these conversations are treated, there's often Myanmar can be discussed at length on some forums, but the spiritual and the practice behind that engagement is often not included, or not so comfortable even with just the reporting of the news. And so that intersection often gets lost, even among Burmese Buddhism and Sangha. And so also seeing different meditative traditions and monasteries, sometimes you feel as if they're in a vacuum, and the in many cases, the source or influence of their teachings coming from Myanmar is quite being neglected from the way they're running their organization and having their own conversations. There's quite a disconnect and disassociation from it. And so I think what we really tried to do, especially for the practitioner audience with interviews like these, is to bring that intersection to them, not in some kind of way of dictating how one should think or what one should do, because it's very, very thorny and difficult right now, but to entertain those discussions of what does engaged Buddhism mean, and what does it mean to take your practice off the cushion, and what does it mean to help people that are in such need, and when there's some kind of gratitude involved for this being the source of many people's practice, how do we navigate and work with all that? So, there are no easy answers, but I think we've at least started the conversation with that.
I think Thich Nhat Hanh created such a wonderful paradigm for socially engaged Buddhism in the Vietnam War. He said, suddenly my country became hell, and he rounded up young people who were motivated by compassion and the Bodhisattva ideal, and started the School for Youth and socially engaged Buddhism and the 14 mindfulness trainings of the Order of Interbeing, because he recognized that happiness isn't just a personal matter, it's a communal one, and that, they meditated together, and then they would go out in acts of solidarity and justice, and engage with society, bringing peace into he wrote that amazing book, Lotus in a Sea of Fire. And, they would go into villages with food. They would teach children in schools. They would help ferry people out of war zones. They helped refugees find boats to escape Vietnam, and help them set up their lives once they'd come into exile. And they kept the dialogue alive of peace and reconciliation. And the amazing thing that Thich Nhat Hanh did was he had Vietnam veterans come with people who had been under their bombing, and they were both sitting in meditation together, and talking about kind of deep listening and kind of reconciliation on a real level, not just on a level where it's superficial. To me, these practices of deep listening and reconciliation were very profound. But that probably would come later on. Right now, Burma is still in the on the fire phase, and has been for many years. And it's such a contradiction that we see. Like it's very similar to Tibet, these cultures with such a beautiful culture of awakening, and having so beautifully preserved the teachings of the Buddha. the teachings of peace and liberation, with this extreme other element coming in, this element of rapacious greed and autocracy and lack of compassion, lack of freedom, and how we face these massive injustices is the measure of our practice. Because I just remember as a nun, not being believed about what it was like to be a nun and to be a second-class citizen, to not receive enough dana to survive, to be constantly told that I'm less than, that it's due to my bad karma, or that I've been born as a woman and I should just remain silent and meditate and not care that I was being treated really badly, to just be silent, and work hard and and the way some people behaved around full ordination, when it came out, the way some people treated nuns as if they were destroying Buddhism for simply doing something that the Buddha had allowed 2,600 years ago, that had a lot of good research behind it and validity, as if women being equal was a threat to the whole Buddhist tradition. Like, personally, I feel that people not being equal, human rights violations, are a threat to the preservation of the Dharma. So I don't know how people can remain apathetic. Like, it's a sign of privilege when you take a spiritual tradition that has been carefully preserved and handed down with so much care from Asia, and you take that and you benefit from it, but you don't give the source credit, and you don't have a sense of duty and gratitude to the Dharma to preserve it and keep those communities that are Buddhist viable, to invest in the fourfold Sangha. Like, people nowadays think they don't even need to go to a center, that they can just go to a teaching online, and that monasteries don't need their support, or that monastics are out of date, that they don't need to invest in community. And yet there are all these people who identify as Buddhist, Westerners, who are now living in vans because they can't afford rent. And there's a whole, generation of young people that may never be able to afford to buy a home or pay off their university fees. And yet we're all still thinking that meditation or liberation is a personal matter. And that, just sitting on our cushion is enough. When the world burns, it's no longer enough. Maybe once it was, but it is no longer.
I think one of the really difficult things to tackle with Myanmar, especially coming from the background of a meditator and even more so from a monastic, is this issue of how do you respond to the Tamada? You cannot negotiate with them. You cannot even talk to them. Any attempt will either result in lies to your face of them saying whatever they want to walk away with the meeting and then taking whatever action they do. We've seen shocking displays of open lies with Minam Lying meeting with ASEAN and saying one thing in the meeting and immediately walking out of the meeting and contradicting himself, and everything he said just being empty. Beyond the inability to have this dialogue, which some observers have very ignorantly and very naively called for a dialogue with a genocidal and murderous mafia terror organization is really what it is. The question begs then, how does one respond? The only action they know is violence. They know suppression. They know how to oppress a nation. They know how to torture and cause enormous fear and submission in people all around. And every attempt over the course of the last year and a half and over the course of the last number of decades has always given the same result. They want to stay in power. They want to stay billionaires. They want to exploit the land and the people. And they are willing to kill, torture, rape, steal, lie, and kill with impunity to whatever extent is needed to stay in control. And when you have a foe like that you're trying to bring to the table, that you're trying to bring about a sense of healthy shame in, even of what it means to be human and what it means to live together, these expressions just fall flat because of the opponent that you're dealing with. And so, because the Burmese activists have tried in so many different ways to engage and show their protests, their pleas, initially to call for dialogue, to find some way of not losing their democracy and human rights, and eventually the military cracked down with terrible, terrible violence of all stripes of people, all ages, all background, monastic and lay, shooting people in the head in broad daylight, beating monks and doctors to death in the street, shooting random bullets into cars, into traffic, people that just happen to be in one space for no intention whatsoever, other than perhaps blind vengeance or just the fun of the cruelty, or to show they're in charge or whatever. And because there was simply no other way to have this dialogue or these kinds of conversations with an enemy that was just so brutal and so evil, much of what was initially the nonviolent protest movement turned into some degree of armed resistance, at least in some quarters, which now has been criticized by many foreign observers again, saying, oh, well, there's violence on both sides and both sides are doing this, and it's a downward cycle. And so these same observers that for months ignored the pleas of so many Burmese to do something, anything to intervene, they are now criticizing those Burmese for trying to defend themselves and try to find some way to not go through another generation of oppression. No one likes to support violence. No one likes to think that violence is the answer. And that's certainly not what I'm saying here. What I'm saying here is the difficulty of decisions at one's disposal. What do you do if an enemy is coming to your village to cause absolute destruction, which is what's happening now? They're burning their way across the countryside, burning everything in their wake, killing everything in their wake. And there is no dialogue to have with people like that. And so from an ethical point of view, from a Buddhist point of view, from a monastic's point of view, and this is something we talked about with Bhikkhu Bodhi at great length, asking him these questions, how does one navigate the ethical challenges and considerations of not wanting to support actions which can bring harm to individuals, no matter who those are, no matter which individuals are being harmed? One does not want to rejoice or support harm being caused to them, and yet also living in an actual reality where, simply put, there is an entrenched evil that is not going to be removed on its own terms and only knows the language of force and is going to continue its oppression unless it's stopped forcefully. So where do you land on this really, really difficult question to untangle?
That's a hard one. I think you have to respond in the moment according to what's going on. I mean, there's an interesting... I'm considered controversial or outspoken for simply saying that Tibetan lamas sleeping with their students, abusing women, treating women as second-class citizens is not okay. Like, that's considered controversial or blasphemous somehow. And sometimes there is this, sometimes the greatest form of evil is just apathy. I grew up watching documentaries and movies about the Holocaust, and it was very much in the public's mind in the 80s. How could that happen? How could 11 million people die, and people just went about their daily life, and allowed a genocide to happen? And what were, like, if you were alive in that time, what were you doing? How could you let this happen? But these kind of things don't happen overnight. They happen a people is kind of considered subhuman over time, to the point where they're not considered equal human beings. They're dehumanized over time. Women are dehumanized over time. Genocide happens over time. There is a campaign to desensitize people to the suffering of a particular group of people and consider them as less than. So addressing those kind of subtle forms of violence needs to happen and needs to be picked up on over time. In terms of what's happening in Burma, it's very immediate, but I think on one hand, there's two kind of things that happen under a situation of genocide. Well, it's not a situation of tremendous violence and corruption. On one hand, there are the people that become soldiers of a corrupt force because they feel they have no other option and they need food. So they allow themselves to become the weapon of a very corrupt and evil regime. So on one hand, civil disobedience of not allowing yourself to become a weapon of a corrupt and evil dictator. And that's a luxury. It's a luxury for me to sit here as a white person and say that. But at the same time, there is a parallel in terms of, if I had just remained silent about the sexual abuse scandals in Buddhism, about the the terrible way nuns and women are treated in general in Buddhism, and in particular in Tibetan Buddhism, the hypocrisy of men who sit on thrones, talk about compassion, and then go home and, rape a teenage girl in the name of consort practice, or the corruption and the lack of access, for equal leadership within Dharma centers, the hypocrisy of that. So on a personal level, to not be afraid and stand up and talk about those things, even if you'll be ostracized. But, here we're talking about people who stand up and ask for that and end up dead. I'm not opposed to, as a last resort, defending yourself. I'm not 100% a pacifist. When I look at what women had to do to get the vote, what the suffragettes had to do, yeah, I'm not a pacifist. I'm not opposed to necessary force, but I think you have to become really, really, be really careful that it's not like an Animal Farm type situation where the people replacing the dictatorship become even more bloodthirsty in their revenge killings, and in the way that they take revenge upon people who committed atrocities against them. And we see it with the communist revolution. Sometimes the revolution eats its children. So it's really hard. It takes a high degree of commitment to human rights and justice to not when you experience violence, to not then become worse than the people who committed violence against you. And examples of this are BIPOC women asking white women to give them a voice and to not, to not exclude them from, and to recognize that they are more oppressed, and to recognize the history of racism and how white women have colluded in the oppression of women of color. White women have benefited from the oppression of people of color. And it's so hard for white women, who have experienced the frustration of patriarchy, to then have to acknowledge, oh, well, actually, yes, I have more privilege. Or, the way that some cisgender women are excluding trans women, from basic human rights and feminism. So the kind of the kind of action required is looking at your own position of privilege and standing with the oppressed, in whatever way you can. But it would be patronizing of me to tell people in Burma what to do, because I'm sitting here safe, well fed. What I can do is use my privilege to lend a voice to those inside Burma, to take the direction from those inside Burma, from those who are experiencing the oppression, and let them lead and support them, and amplify their voices, rather than, me as a white person telling them what to do. Peace is always the best option wherever possible. Human rights is always the best option wherever possible. But there may be a case where we need sanctions against this regime, where we need to remove them from power, where we maybe need a peacekeeping force. And, the Buddha, there was a time where he sat by the side of the road under a dead tree to stop King Ajatasattu, who was invading his homeland, to massacre the Sakyans. And the king said, "Why are you sitting under this dead tree? It doesn't give any shade." And he said, "Well, this soothes me because it's in my beloved homeland." So there was a time when the Buddha actually advocated, and the king turned around, saw it as a bad omen, and didn't massacre the Sakyans. But then later on, a king did massacre the Sakyans. So even the Buddha himself stood against an invasion at a time where he saw he could make an impact, and at a time where he saw he couldn't make an impact, he chose to act in a different way. Generally, I think the Buddha did say, don't kill, do no harm is the first and foremost. But we have to acknowledge that sometimes doing nothing is also a form of harm. So it's never easy. It's never black and white. And, peacekeeping forces, self-defense may sometimes be necessary.
And I think this also just brings up the the messiness of what engaging in the world and seeing the world as it is brings. And that's not an excuse to not engage. I think that's kind of the definition of spiritual bypass, is people that just see everything as preordained by karma, and the world is just a messy place where the simple practice of meditation allows me to have some relief and refuge from that, and that it's kind of foolhardy to engage in any direction with seeing how imperfect everything is. And that becomes kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So it's no excuse to not engage. It's actually more of an impetus to increase one's wisdom through engagement, through open-eyed engagement that is able to see the world for what it is, and learn how through wisdom and discernment one can play some kind of positive role in that in the lives of others, knowing the social way of humanity that we're all a part of, and trying to learn how to do that. But, that being said, it is it's very tricky in Myanmar, or it can be, when we talk about the ways that someone can engage, there's certainly a way to engage where just this whole question of armed resistance, one just leaves that aside. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with saying, I am going to support people in IDP camps. I'm going to support monks that don't have food. I'm going to talk about political prisoners. I'm going to advocate for human rights and democracy. And one can certainly pick those areas which are more comfortable and more suitable for their background, and to leave aside the things that are messy for now. There's no need to engage in all of it, and certainly to, not make certain ethical transgressions that one would be uncomfortable with. So I think another excuse I've heard that's really not correct is people who look at this armed resistance and use that as an excuse to not want to get involved in anything. Just kind of see a messy, violent political world where the monastery is the refuge. Of course, in Myanmar, the monastery is not the refuge. Monasteries are being burned down. They're being bombed. They're being taken over by military as bases to stage operations into clearance operations of nearby towns. So in Myanmar, there is no monastery or meditation that is a refuge right now. But for those that are looking to help and engage, there's definitely a way to do those things that are comfortable and leave aside those things. One has the privilege and the luxury out of the country. One does not have this in the country, but out of the country, one has the privilege and the luxury to be able to say, I'm not comfortable with this part of it. I'm not going to judge it, but I'm just not going to touch it. And I'm going to put my energies and efforts into these areas. And I don't see any problem with that. I think that there's so much need everywhere that choosing where one puts one efforts and attention, that's certainly very helpful in its own right. But for those monastics and meditators that perhaps, for lack of a better word, have a higher calling and are willing to wade into the messiness, as you and I are in this conversation, having a conversation where there are no good answers. We're not going to smell like roses coming out of any part of this discussion, because it's just a very ugly and messy situation that is currently going on and that we're trying to understand. But for those of us who are willing to wade through that, there does come this question of understanding why those who have decided to join the armed resistance, why they have done so, and where we situate ourselves in that. And it's not black and white. It's not as if one condemns them and judges them, or one supports them and funds them and gives them guns and bullets. It's not that there's this. This is a false binary of assuming that you can either do one or the other. There is even just a place for bearing witness, and I think that's what we try to do on this platform is to bear witness. And when we bring stories of those fighters who joined the armed resistance, it's not to glamorize them or to highlight them as being on the right side. It's to understand them, because I think the most harmful thing we can do is just close our minds off to understanding and to judge and to say, well, this person's like this and that group is like that, and they shouldn't be like this. And then we're using our privilege as a screen to not understand the decisions that others are making. And so I think in this very difficult and sensitive issue, trying to have an understanding and engagement of simply where do I, as a monastic or a meditator, where do I want to situate myself in this? Do I want to ignore it completely and focus on strictly humanitarian parts, or do I want to engage in a discussion and a reflection intersecting with Buddhist ethics and the reality of what they're going through, and just try to figure out where these all fit together and what my place is in it? And this is it's just enormously difficult to come at the end of this, because as we mentioned, there are no good answers. There is no wisdom that is going to somehow land on something that checks all the boxes. You're either going to be pushed into one uncomfortable position or another with it. And but I don't think that precludes the fact that it shouldn't be talked about or thought about just because it is so different, or dismissed because, oh, the world is messy and this is samsara and everything is according to its karma, and I don't get involved in violence or politics or other things. I think those are real excuses of spiritual bypass, which perhaps show a lack of spiritual fortitude in not taking on real world considerations of a place where many of these lineages come from in the first place, and which has been so generous to foreign practitioners. So it's really hard to talk about, is really the takeaway from this.
I think, to be honest, like I see a lot of passive aggressiveness sometimes in some portions of the Buddhist community, an apathy disguised as equanimity. I think a lot of people are very afraid of what they perceive to be harsh speech or anger. So they suppress it, but it just comes out as, like what we really have to do in the long term is really examine the systems of oppression in ourselves that we still benefit from, and it happens quite often that someone will try to speak about their oppression and be told that they're being angry, or they're creating dissent, or they're speaking from a place of negative emotions and that they need to be quiet. And, really that's just another kind of form of tone policing and inverted violence. And the people who are most often, tone policing them are the people that benefit from their oppression. So, there is a place for what we call sacred rage, which is, it's not like, it's the process where we allow ourselves to feel what we feel and be angry, but not be destructive with our anger. It's the place where we allow anger to arise and we process it and understand the causes of it, and then allow it to be tempered into compassion and empathy. And of course, that needs to be for both sides, on a bigger scale. But when you have embodied, and processed and worked through anger, I don't think you just come to a place where you're just not angry anymore, unless you're a Buddha. But I think it can be a catalyst for compassionate acts, because basically I just got so tired of being told to be silent and pretend that nothing bad was happening, that women weren't being raped in the name of Buddhism or, enlightenment or tantric practice, or that children weren't starving, and that we should just sit in our cocoon of privilege and not worry about it, that I could no longer do nothing, and I no longer cared what people thought of me. I mean, of course you should uphold your precepts and try to speak in such a way that others can hear you. But there are people who are so invested in their privilege and the power that oppression gives them that they're never going to listen anyway. So you need to try and reach the people who are more centrist, who will listen. And, I mean, literally everybody, it's so funny, white liberals quote Martin Luther King now, but in the 60s, he was hated. He was hated. His name was Mud. And we tend to take the parts of what he said that are palatable to our comfort, and we diminish his radical nature. Even Thich Nhat Hanh, I think, in the 60s was pretty radical, and we tend to take the parts of what he says about peace that don't threaten us, that don't upset our privilege, that don't make us question how our peace and our comfort is related to the oppression of people in developing countries and the destruction of the planet. Because when you see that you're actually part of the violence, that your comfort is part of the violence, like your cheap clothes, your cheap petrol, your clean environment, because your pollution, your garbage has been sent out to sea or sent off to China. Like, we are actually part of the violence. We can't pretend we're not. We all are both the victim and the perpetrator. And when you see that, you realize that you do actually have, like, doing nothing is also a form of, can also be a form of violence. So either way, it's messy, but you just have to do what you can to stand for, justice, and to have empathy, and make sure that whatever violence and oppression you've experienced is not, that the cycle of violence is broken, and that you're not continuing to perpetrate the deadly ignorance that leads to the misery of others. Like, there is a word, anukampa, which means quivering with compassion, and it means like feeling with others. So for me, my spiritual practice, especially my meditation on bodhicitta, that everybody's been my mother, everybody's been my best friend, everybody's been my child. It was a very powerful kind of realization. And you would think, wow, it's so exhausting to just be in sympathy with everybody. But if you also develop self-care and also take out your mental trash through contemplative practice, through watering seeds of happiness and joy, and purifying the mind, the more space you create in your heart, the more capacity and resilience you build to then go out and engage with what is happening in the world. But the funny thing is that often people can't see and they won't listen. Like, I honestly didn't really understand why people of color were angry, because I grew up in a white middle-class family where we thought, racism was over because they're equal now, they have the same rights as us. And I didn't understand subtle racism and preconceptions that have been handed down to me from my white ancestors to suppress the horror of colonization and exploitation and slavery, that we can live with ourselves, the lies we tell ourselves. And it was only when I really experienced this blatant kind of sexism and violence as a street kid that I started to empathize and listen to queer people and listen to people of color and listen to poor people and, see things from their perspective and open my heart to that, And I think a lot of men have this incapacity to hear women. They're like, what are you complaining about? Haven't we done enough? Like, isn't it enough? Why are you still whinging? And they just don't. There's just not. Their heart is not open to the reality that we don't live in the same world. Women and men do not live in the same world. When we walk down the street, we are seen differently. Different expectations are placed upon us. So I think, spiritual practice is not just about finding peace. It's about radically undoing the deceptions around your own separateness and, looking at your own, the systems of violence that you participate in knowingly or unknowingly, how you gain privilege from that, and knowing it, you choose to ignore it, which is a form of violence, which, in turn allows those atrocities to happen, or you stand as an ally and do what you can to undo that violence and to give people who are more oppressed than you a platform, and that there's plenty of denial, there's plenty of suppressed emotions and plenty of, contempt for people that actually speak about their oppression. There's plenty of passive aggressiveness in the name of orthodoxy that is also harmful. So, we all have to start undoing that internalized patriarchy and that internalized colonizer mentality and white supremacy and, all of those things inside of us, that always periodically manifest in humans' inhumanity to humanity, where we other someone, because these kinds of horrific things are only possible when we dehumanize someone and other them and see them as a human being not as a human being like ourselves, with the same feelings and the same needs and the same longings. When you really empathize with someone, it becomes very hard to commit, to ignore injustice.
Why do you think this is? Why do you think there's this discomfort and this resistance to wanting to hear the stories of oppression, wanting to hear the discomfort that people of different backgrounds have suffered in being a minority? And whether it's in the name of orthodoxy or whatever else, why do you think there is this hesitancy and resistance and even anger, passive anger, as you put it, to not be able to sit with this. It doesn't seem like something from the outset that should be that hard to be able to bear witness to and understand. And yet there is this, a lot of games that are played in trying to avoid simply hearing, simply listening, nothing beyond that for the moment, just simply taking account of what someone not like oneself has gone through. Where do you think that comes from?
I think we have a lot of unconscious investment in in keeping our own position. So if you've grown up believing that you literally deserve more than another human being and that certain things are expected of you as a man or as a woman, and somebody comes in and turns that on its head and said everything you believe and value is wrong, that can be challenging. That challenges your sense of self-identity. It also means that it's harder to hold on to your hoarded resources, and makes you question yourself. But also, if you've never had access to that kind of information, like I remember growing up, I was never taught that we gave the indigenous population smallpox blankets or rounded them up and pushed them off cliffs or, raped their women. I was just told that they kind of benevolently made way for a greater civilization. That was the subtext, that they just magically disappeared. Maybe they died of diseases they didn't have immunity to, but it wasn't kind of given the honest truth that it was a genocide to make way for white civilization. It's just astounding how history is written by the victor, and until you delve into your own suffering and the lies you tell yourself, it's just easy to go along with the status quo. So I think it takes a bit of an independent thinker and someone who has, looked at themselves honestly and knows they're not perfect. But I also think part of it is perhaps a lot of people grappling with their own suffering, overwhelmed with their own suffering, that they maybe don't have the mental space to take on the idea of someone who is not immediately in front of them. Like if you put the average Westerner in Africa or in the Congo or in the midst of a war, they would probably be shocked and they would probably do what they could to help the people in front of them. But because they're not those people, those starving children 40,000 who die every day, those people who are put in jail for just asking for human rights are not in front of them, it's hard for them to believe that these things are going on. And sometimes right in the midst of their name. Like if you took a Western young person who's a fashionista and loves fast fashion and showed them a Bangladeshi slum where women are chained to sewing machines 20 hours a day, they would probably cry and be horrified. But because it's not right in front of them and they can't make that emotional connect, they continue to buy fast fashion or they continue to invest in products that create wars in the Middle East or, mean children are enslaved. Like, that shiny stuff women put on their face, mica. There are children in Bihar in northern India, crushing that up with hammers. But that's not the front. The front end is some woman going, love yourself, put on this shiny stuff, you'll feel fantastic. We don't make the connect. We don't even the technology we're using is mined by children in Africa. The parts we need for computers and laptops. It's really hard to be truly ethical because it's this tangled web of it's messy. But what we can do is what we can do, and most of us, if we took care of just say 5 other people, if we took care of their well-being, if we sponsored a kid in Africa or Burma, if we, on our birthday, if we donated $200 to feed some children in a developing country, if we, encouraged our government to divest from fossil fuels, like each of us can and should make a difference, and we can do what we can do. But I think it's because people have they're drowning in the complications of modern life, and they're pursuing their own desires. They're, as the Buddha said, this generation is entangled in a tangle. And they're overwhelmed by their own suffering, so they don't have the mental space or time to comprehend something that's not right in front of them. But someone who goes deeper into their practice and sees the web of interbeing, where do my clothes come from? Where does my food come from? Who went before me to advocate so that I would have the vote as a woman, or so that I would have universal health care, or so that the poor would have a minimum wage or an unemployment benefit or a single parent's benefit, or social housing, or a limit of work hours per week. All as time goes on, a lot of these things we're kind of going backwards, in terms of human rights. But we need to see the web that we exist in, and how others' oppression sometimes leads to our comfort, and to be more conscious in how we're living, more simple in how we're living, to redirect our resources so that there is a more even distribution of resources, to care for the planet and to care for each other. I do believe we could make a difference imagine if everybody stopped buying things from unethical corporations. Imagine if governments divested from fossil fuels. Imagine if we stopped investing in finance companies that are, selling arms and so forth. It's about awareness, so sometimes that awareness is lacking because people are self-absorbed and they can't see themselves in the greater whole. They can't see themselves in the bigger picture. And hopefully, one would hope that spiritual practice would make you more aware of your sacred relationship with all of life. But unfortunately, some people tend to use spiritual practice as a place to hide rather than as a place to grow and to open up. But we can keep hoping that they will eventually stop using spirituality to maintain their privilege and comfort, but to more open up and develop empathy and compassion. And, there's nothing wrong with, just seeking peace and seeking your own peace from spiritual practice. That's a starting point. But it can't be where you stay your whole life. It's like staying in preschool and never going to college. There comes a point where you need to take the good things you've learned into the world and not remain silent in the face of injustice, and not be co-opted by money and by security to support atrocities or to be silent about exploitation.
We've been talking as Westerners who are on the spiritual path as monastics or lay meditators, and obviously we have to look at our background and the society and culture that we come from as Westerners and the values that we hold. And I've heard from some of my Burmese friends a disappointment in their Buddhism in Myanmar not being welcome or open to certain values. And by those values, I don't just mean progressive values, what we might call progressive values about like the role of nuns in Burmese society, or the interaction with other ethnic communities, particularly the Rohingya, or the proximity of the military, but even wider issues like even wider issues like education and the style of education, the style of learning that takes place, and how one is exposed to the world, and whether it's more rote learning that is geared towards monastic exams, which are actually relatively new in Myanmar Sangha. They came about only in the past, 150 years. Kamai Dhammasami has written extensively on that and really recommend his works to anyone who wants to know more about how monastic exam culture has transformed the Sangha, probably for the worse, and at least in his estimation, and wanting to really reinvigorate the style of education and awareness of the world and of others, which would then hopefully bring to wider values and being able to integrate being a member of the global community while also being on not just the Buddhist path, but also the monastic path. And some of my Burmese friends have really expressed a sense of not just disappointment, but actually more like pessimism, more like hopelessness, that what they hear of this quote unquote engaged Buddhism in other countries is something they very rarely see in their own country, and is really kept down by some of the leaders of the political and monastic and even lay supportive institutions. And as someone like yourself, who has been a monastic for so long, who has lived in West and East, who has studied under Eastern teachers, and I'm sure that you have many monastic peers that are from Asia, from different Asian countries. I wonder how you find their values manifesting. These are different cultures, so they're going to be manifested in different ways. There's going to be different pathways to bringing out the change one wants to see in the world and integrating it within what has to be said is a conservative and very strict ethical practice that one has to abide by. But the way one does that will differ according to the backgrounds and the culture and everything else. So because up to this point, we've been talking so much as Westerners, I wonder if you can share something of what you've seen among interactions with Asian monastics, Asian monks and nuns from all the different Asian countries where there are Buddhist monastics. How you've seen their struggles, their aspirations, their challenges, the work they've tried to implement in their own ways, because often even there has been criticism of Westerners with their own progressive values then going to non-Western countries and trying to impose their progressive way of understanding the world into a country with completely different contexts. And so it's just super ironic. It's this kind of, really weird sense of neo-colonialism that is trying to espouse anti-colonialist values, but isn't realizing the way that they're still imposing their belief system onto another without properly understanding it. So if we switch our attention to this struggle and this intention in Asian context, what have you, and I'm asking you this based on the conversations you've had, so not to guesstimate or not to speak for them, but because I'm sure you've had so many interactions with different Asian monastics who have been doing this in their own way. In relaying the nature of those conversations to us, how have you seen them in trying to bring this forward? How has it differed from what you might find in the West, and how have they been doing it in a native, localized way that's relevant and practical for them without being borrowed and superimposed from Western modes of thinking?
I don't necessarily think that engaged Buddhism is a Western thing, or that gender equality is a Western thing, or that not being homophobic is a Western thing. I know the Ambedkarite community in India is, the monastics are quite outspoken about caste oppression, committed to educating women and democracy, and they frequently talk about this in their Dharma talks, and they join in marches. In fact, I would say they're a highly political group of Buddhists. Maybe a little more meditation might be good, but they're living under, like, people. The casteism in India is still very virulent, and women are still gang raped. People who have an intercaste marriage are still lynched. there are towns where lower caste people are still not allowed into a Hindu temple, and the majority of poor people and people doing sweeping and, really cleaning out sewers and really difficult, degrading work without any protective equipment are still mostly tribal and people from backward castes. So the reality is they're still living under that oppression of apartheid, if you will. So that, because they're facing that injustice and that poverty, they're very politically active in what they call educating, agitating, organizing. And they're not afraid to be outspoken. I've seen in Thailand, Ayya Dhammananda and the nuns there who took full ordination and have been advocating for ordination, because it's still, as far as I know, illegal to ordain nuns within Thailand. They go and they get ordained in Sri Lanka and then they cross the border again. And they're still not recognized as monastics by the state. They carry a security card that says they're mechis, which is really somewhere in between a layperson and a monastic. And they themselves want that full ordination. It's not imposed by Western nuns. That was something given by the Buddha to nuns. And, it's very clearly shown in countries like Korea, Vietnam, China, that women who do have full ordination on the whole tend to be better resourced, better educated, and have a better standard of living. The nuns I've seen with full ordination are much more empowered. Not to say that, I can't speak to the practice. I know there are many accomplished, deeply enlightened 8 precept nuns who are very impressive, but it would just be so much easier, so much less of a struggle if you didn't have to constantly face gender inequality and misogyny, in your pursuit of the spiritual path. As I said, socially engaged Buddhism, like Thich Nhat Hanh and the Vietnam War, the Order of Interbeing, all the schools he set up, the triage centers, the refugee camps, and as you mentioned, the Japanese monk who started the socially engaged movement and the non-nuclear proliferation activism. So this socially engaged Buddhism, this movement towards full ordination, gender equality, ending homophobia, it's all happening in Asia as well. It's not like there is a no desire within the Asian community to see these things. What I see as the problem is when Buddhism is married to the state, or any religion is married to the state, it becomes a way for the state to control resources and to mandate their power and to dictate the status quo. So I think people really have to examine what is Buddhism, what is the radical liberation of the heart, versus what is culture, what is the state mandate, what is the state co-opting the teachings of liberation, and seek for yourself. Like the Buddha said, test the teachings like a goldsmith tests gold in order to determine its purity. Like, did the Buddha teach homophobia? Is it anywhere in the Pali Canon? No, it's not. But it's just become part of cultural superstition that it's handed down, that kind of it's an aberration or it's unacceptable, or, the confusion about the mixing up of pedophilia with gay men or something like that, this stupidity of the unknown, of what is not understood. And there are within the Plum Village Sangha, there are Asian monastics speaking about how they once held homophobia just due to cultural influence, and then they actually met queer people and realized everything they'd been taught was superstition and bigotry. So I don't think it's a East-West thing. I think it's just a kind of othering, that othering, that apathy, that not questioning what you've been fed. And there are plenty of Asian monastics advocating for an end to gender inequality, an end to homophobia, an end to racism and selective history, and the denial of what the host cultures have done to indigenous cultures, because it isn't just white people who committed atrocities against native people. That's through the history of humanity, the invaders displacing or committing genocide against the indigenous community and enslaving them and so forth. So I think there are plenty of Asian monastics standing up for these kind of things, but there's also a fair amount of people who think that society is a big mess and you can't fix it, so you should just meditate and leave the world to itself, because there's always been greed and suffering and misery and you can't do anything to change it. But history has been changed by people who really, like, what if the suffragettes had just got up and went, no, we don't think we can change, women should remain subjugated without the vote and birth control. Or what if the union members had never said, hey, we really like our 10-year-olds losing their fingers in the cotton mill and the mines, so let's just keep that going. Like, what if Louis Pasteur had decided to not, investigate science? Like, history is changed by those who question the status quo and dare to look for a better future. So you could be part of the crowd that just maintains the status quo and believes the maintains the privilege of the oppressors and the wealthy class, or you can be someone who dares to question and investigate history and look at your own heart. I don't think it's an East-West thing. I just think it's a kind of examine where your comfort is and who provides your comfort. At what expense is your comfort coming from? Dr. Ambedkar, converted to Buddhism, was the Martin Luther King of his people, was the first Dalit person to get an education. And he had to sit outside the classroom. He had to sit outside the door. They wouldn't let him in the classroom because they believed he would pollute the upper class students, and he suffered a great deal, and eventually he, created a nonviolent resistance, civil disobedience, and created reservations in schools and government jobs, and legislation protecting women and people of backward castes. So, change doesn't always, we're talking about a lifetime of frustration. We're not just talking about things happening. You have to view social justice as a marathon, not a 100-meter race. And understand that this is a battle started long before us and will continue to rage after us. But we can do what we can do in the time that is given to us. And carry peace in our heart. Carry peace in our heart as much as possible as we carry that forward. Because it is important to remember that we have been the perpetrator in the past. Perpetrator and victim are just masks we exchange. So understanding that the enemy is also can change. The enemy is also human. I mean, there's the nuns in Tibet who are singing from prison. It's that actually a lot of monastics in Tibet have protested have maybe committed acts of vandalism or sometimes set themselves on fire, which is not something I personally condone, but they're just so desperate, you know. They feel as monastics they are unattached, they don't have a family depending on them, so they are more willing to go to prison and protest. Yeah. So, you know, you literally have monastics going to jail, protesting, dying, being tortured for freedom.
And I think what you're also touching upon from what you said is the investigation of privilege. And I think that many of us that live in free and democratic societies, there were people who made all kinds of unimaginable sacrifices to get us into this place where we can enjoy things that without ever knowing the struggle. And I think what we're seeing in Myanmar right now is just the facade ripped off of that. And there is no safety anywhere. There's no authority anywhere that is safeguarding everything. And so any measure of safety or rights that one wants to have, in many cases, one has to actually fight for. That doesn't necessarily mean armed resistance, but fight in some way. One has to sacrifice for is probably a better way to put it. And I think one of the things I saw as the conflict was going on were judgments from people in places of position and safety and privilege, for sure, whose ancestors had made those sacrifices so that they could enjoy those privileges of a freer society. There's no society that's perfectly free, of course. Everywhere has its own biases and problems and discriminations, but places where there are relatively greater amounts of freedom and safety, that if you look at the history of how it got there, it was very messy. It was very chaotic and ugly and uncomfortable and messy and everything else that you'd say about the world. And how fast we forget that history and how much we become, we incorporate a feeling of, well, this is the way things have always been. This is the natural order of things. This is what I'm born into, is the way things are, and not realizing the pathway to creating that world we live in. And I think one of the things that we're seeing in Myanmar is that everything has been ripped off, and that if you want to have something for your life or your community, there's no one else to do it for you. You have to do the messiness. You have to engage in the messiness to keep yourself safe and to make hard decisions and to understand how to respond to a very brutal and cruel and evil oppressor in the form of the military. And so I think any understanding that we develop in terms of how they're going needs to take in that consideration of what society we're living in, and not only that, but what conditions have led to that society to create those measures of freedom that we now enjoy. Who has done that on our behalf? Who has taken actions that maybe we would condemn if we knew the full extent, but somehow through those actions, through that messiness, we've ended up where we're at now. And that's just a very uncomfortable thing to have to parse through and have to understand. And I'm not in any way advocating on the side of being an apologist for cruel or inhumane or violent acts happening, or advocating the right or the justification of those, of whichever units or groups to do what they're doing, but rather to bring that understanding, because I'm just figuring this out and thinking this through along with everyone else. I'm not at the end of that discussion. I'm still in the process of it. But I think that as we're in the process of that discussion, we have to bring those things to bear. And we do have to consider what was done in our respective societies to bring us where we are today, and in its own imperfect way, and what stage of the process is Myanmar in at this time in trying to, in their own messy way and in their own imperfect ways, and faced in a system that is far from equitable or fair in terms of how they are able to respond to it, and understanding that they are moving through that in their own way, just as happened in our societies in previous generations that we've so easily forgot. And I think that understanding is just so critical for trying to gain a deeper appreciation for what is happening now and what they're trying to do. So that's something that can be hard for those of us here to bring those things to bear when on the surface, we don't have to live in the kind of fear and the kind of oppression that is going on there now.
I mean, it's interesting because when you say we, who do you mean? Because people of color have to teach their sons to not walk down the street in a hoodie and they're not safe. As a street kid, I'm not comparing. Absolutely can't compare myself to Myanmar, but I'm just saying this comfort is not like there is a whole subgroup of hundreds of thousands of people in the US that are homeless, living in tents and RVs. And when they sleep at night, they sleep with one eye open. As a street kid, I slept with one eye open. As a Buddhist nun, I've been homeless. As a street kid, teenager, men were predators with me. So, people of color, poor people, do not live in the same world of comfort that you're speaking about. It's just when you cross the border into a developed country, the chaos is more pronounced. But I'm absolutely not comparing that to Myanmar. I'm just saying that not everyone lives in this myth of suburban comfort and safety and security. But it is also true, and we can see how fragile democracy is. We literally had people breaking into government buildings and holding elected officials hostage, and we had a whole bunch of people believing, in quite disturbing conspiracies, like even refusing to wear masks to keep other people safe, to keep disabled and immunocompromised people safe. Like the degree of narcissism and the extreme of individualism carried way too far. But yeah, life is messy and life is a struggle, and we have to do the best we can to be compassionate and to stand for the good. And yeah, it's just unimaginable what is happening in Myanmar, what is happening in Tibet. But yeah, to sit back from our armchairs and say we should be nonviolent as the bullet comes flying for our children's head is just, maybe not. It's just really not that simple, is it? And yeah, I mean, I think we just probably need to start first and foremost by listening to those people who are in those situations about what they need and what it's like, and go from there rather than imposing our own comfortable world values on a situation that is so completely different. But there's no denying that that chaos has always broken through in humanity and continues to dominate, and to look at for real world solutions so that we can kind of save the planet. I mean, another huge issue on the horizon is climate change. I mean, we're talking about the apocalypse, and we know it's there, and we have not taken our foot off the accelerator as we drive ourselves over the cliff of oblivion. It's a kind of pathology where we're so addicted to shiny things that we can't save ourselves, even though we know we need to. I think a lot of people feel helpless in the face of this kind of our leaders, corporations, people with power, billionaires, are just living as if they can go to Mars or leave us all behind or something. We feel helpless to make changes that we need. And that's why I think grassroots movements are really important. Things like Extinction Rebellion, civil disobedience, and like food banks and growing your own veggies, and from the ground up. I mean, I started Bodhicitta Foundation with very little resources. I just started buying some school uniforms for kids and some medicine, and it just grew from there. But I really hope positive change will happen, and positive change doesn't happen without hardship. I was really curious about what Bhikkhu Bodhi said about this, in the face of violence and war, what one can do as a Buddhist.
The best thing to do is probably listen to his words exactly on it, because we spent 2 podcast conversations of 4 hours, not talking about that specifically, talking about other topics as well. But I would say probably half the time was devoted to that question of violence. And he got a lot of pushback from the first interview and wanted to do a second one to clarify his comments. And he also went through his own inner reflection. But yeah, I probably would hesitate to try to summarize, because it's really a journey, those conversations and the 2 conversations are spaced out, half a year or something. So they reflect also a different understanding of what he was wading into. But they're very nuanced. They're very contemplative, and trying to, I guess the one thing I would say that really characterizes, the many hours of talk is, his understanding that the ethics, the Buddhist ethics can be seen not as literal, words of from the heavens that need to be applied to every situation, but rather a framework or a guide for facing complicated ethical situations that one's analytical skills and ethical determination needs to work out in a critical way. And that got a lot of pushback from the more authoritarian and traditional practitioners and monks that really saw that as like, you're denying the literal word of Buddhism, and so that, his remarks and his take in that way just showed that divergence. But there's a lot, he goes into a lot of detail, but that's kind of a general framework he takes.
Sounds a bit like the abortion issue, that on one hand, Buddhists are pretty clear, like, don't take life. But it's so much more complex than that, because there are situations where it's very damaging for the woman or the child to carry the pregnancy through. So that's part of the nuance of human existence, right? That in the sense that it has to be applied to the situation you're in that moment, to try and, like, on one hand, I might say, yes, we might, self-defense is reasonable and we might need a peacekeeping force. And on the other hand, I don't necessarily want to be the one holding the gun. So that challenge.
Right. And that's what I was getting at before in the example about, right. And that's when I was giving the example of how there's this rawness and nakedness in Myanmar, is that you can't really count on the state to act in a way of safety for certain rights. And there are just basic privileges that a lot of us enjoy, that, despite the obvious bias and discrimination on some forms, there's no, whatever's happening in all of these other countries outside, nothing holds a candle to what's going on in Myanmar. And there is no system of any kind, no police system, no representative system, no legal system, no safeguard of any type. Everything is off the rails of someone who's going to act in your interest, and kind of trusting a system for justice or protection or anything else. And so with those things completely stripped away, one is left completely and entirely that if you want to live according to certain principles of just even basic safety or rights, you have to find out a way to, you might have to be the one holding the gun, or you might have to be the one supplying the gun, or you might have to be the one setting up neighborhood watches or determining what to do with a spy who has already caused the death of several people in your community, and on and on. I mean, you are faced with these decisions that in a more advanced society, they're kind of done for you. And if even though there are obviously very blatant imperfections of those systems, there are still mechanisms, and some people are more privileged in those mechanisms, but there still is a way to rely on certain systems, or to go through certain systems to seek change or protection or compensation or something else. And in Myanmar, that has just been removed and stripped away entirely. And so your communities are left to their own devices to determine what if there are things they hold dear, they have to be the ones that are causing that change or bringing that protection or whatever else. And that's a very shocking thing to determine. And, I think even in, I think whatever one's background is and whatever one's living there, in certainly in most Western places, things are better today for that group than they were some time ago. There has been improvement, and that improvement has come from the blood and the sweat and the tears of those people that have made those sacrifices to provide that better life, even as we're still striving for further change and further improvement. And I think it's just whatever our background is and whatever particular sacrifices have been made by those of our background, it's just very easy to forget what they've done to give us the life that we have now, even with those imperfections. So, yeah.
It's like you said, there's nothing that holds a candle to it except maybe Tibet or Afghanistan, but it reminds me just a little bit of life in the slum, in the sense that you can't rely on the government to provide that much. And like there are laws in place. For example, there's laws against dowry, there's laws against child labor, there's laws against marital rape, but all of those things happen, and the law doesn't really protect anyone unless they're rich. That you have to kind of create your own small networks and groups of solidarity to resist the blatant greed and corruption all around you, and the apathy all around you, in the sense that your own leaders are defrauding you and invested in your oppression rather than your well-being. And they're basically goons, like mafia, put in power by interested parties to maintain their privilege and to maintain your oppression, because they profit from your oppression. It's tough, but to not curse the darkness but light a candle, to create small acts of compassion and solidarity and courage in the face of such brutality. And for those of us with more privilege to, do what we can, I guess.
Yeah, and I think that's probably a good place to close. So thank you so much for having this conversation with us and taking the time to explore and explain your background and the work you're doing, and especially how that applies and intersects with the terrible things going on in Myanmar. I think you really bring a very valuable perspective of all the social engagement combined with Buddhist practice, culminating in this engaged Buddhist understanding, and bringing that to our awareness of what's happening in Myanmar and what we can do. And I just think it's been very valuable to check in and get that perspective, and to inform us on how we, especially as those listening who happen to be Buddhist practitioners, I'm sure non-Buddhist spiritual practitioners as well, there's some intersection and some gold to get from that. And just thanks for taking the time to do that.
Thank you so much.
Many listeners know that in addition to running these podcast episodes, we also run a nonprofit, Better Burma, which carries out humanitarian projects across Myanmar. While we regularly post about current needs and proposals from groups on the ground, we also handle emergency requests, often in matters that are quite literally life or death. When those urgent requests come in, we have no time to conduct targeted fundraisers, as these funds are often needed within hours. So please consider helping us to maintain this emergency fund. We want to stress that literally any amount you can give allows us to respond more flexibly and effectively when disaster strikes. If you would like to join in our mission to support those in Myanmar who are being impacted by the military coup, we welcome your contribution in any form, currency, or transfer method. Your donation will go on to support a wide range of humanitarian and media missions, aiding those local communities who need it most. Donations are directed to such causes as the Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM, families of deceased victims, internally displaced person IDP camps, food for impoverished communities, military defection campaigns, undercover journalists, refugee camps, monasteries and nunneries, education initiatives, the purchasing of protective equipment and medical supplies, COVID relief, and more. We also make sure that our donation fund supports a diverse range of religious and ethnic groups across the country. We invite you to visit our website to learn more about past projects as well as upcoming needs. You can give a general donation or earmark your contribution to a specific activity or project you would like to support, perhaps even something you heard about in this very episode. All of this humanitarian work is carried out by our nonprofit mission, Better Burma. Any donation you give on our Insight Myanmar website is directed towards this fund. Alternatively, you can also visit the Better Burma website, betterburma.org, and donate directly there. In either case, your donation goes to the same cause, and both websites accept credit card. You can also give via PayPal by going to paypal.me/betterburma. Additionally, we can take donations through Patreon, Venmo, GoFundMe, and Cash App. Simply search Better Burma on each platform and you'll find our account. You can also visit either website for specific links to these respective accounts or email us at info@betterburma.org. That's Better Burma, one word, spelled BETTERBURMA.org. If you would like to give it another way, please contact us. We also invite you to check out our range of handicrafts that are sourced from vulnerable artisan communities across Myanmar, available at alokacrafts.com. Any purchase will not only support these artisan communities, but also our nonprofit's wider mission. That's Aloka Crafts, spelled ALOKACRAFTS, one word, alokacrafts.com. Thank you so much for your kind consideration and support.